Welcome. I'm Ron Baker. I'm the director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, affiliated with Small Church Connections here in Canada. And today we have a great opportunity to have with us another person who hangs out in Canada, who enjoys ministry, and gives us some really great opportunities, I think, for looking at models of ministry in networks. So I'm going to just invite, I was going to tell you he was Dave Witt, but I'm going to invite whoever our guest is to tell you who he is, and we'll get going from there. Just tell a little bit about who you are and anything you want to say, Dave. That'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Dave Witt, and I live and work in Hamilton, Ontario. And for the last 17 years, I've had the privilege of helping to facilitate a network of churches here in Hamilton, a network called True City, that have been a group of churches that came together around a vision of blessing the city. So our kind of the tagline for the network is churches together for the good of the city.
Oh, great.
Really,
yeah.
Comes out of some of the missional stuff that was just getting some traction at that point, and how we could collaborate together around those things.
Okay, now you're the name of the group is True City. Where did that come from?
Yeah, well, we were really looking for a way to capture this idea of being for the city, and the idea that God has a shalom, a vibrant intention for the city that wants us to be flourishing, and so that idea of the true vision that God has for Hamilton, Hamilton's best. What would it look like for Hamilton to be at its best, and how does the church get to contribute to that? That was what we were looking to capture, and that was the name that we came up with for it.
Oh, great. Now, you come out of a whole background of missions too. And so very much this missional idea. Can you give us just a little background of where you came, how you came into that, maybe even a little bit of where your conviction and your own vision for what you've ended up doing?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, my wife and I were missionaries in the Philippines for 10 years. Worked among the urban poor in Metro Manila, church planting, some community development work and one of the key things that happened in the midst of that time in the Philippines was that the organization we were with made a transition from being North American led to being Filipino led, and really recognizing how that combination of Filipino leadership with North Americans in the mix of that, how that unleashed some stuff that wasn't there when it was just a North American led organization, and really recognizing how Filipinos were missionaries in their own context. Our tradition had struggled to kind of figure out the categories for those things, but that they brought things to the ministry that we could never bring. They had insights that we didn't have from our own cultural perspective, and that the combination of those was really powerful. So I think coming back to North America, I'm originally from the States. My wife is from Hamilton. So when we came to Hamilton, this question of, well, what's the mission that God's on in Hamilton? What's God's intention for Hamilton? And how does he call the church to be engaged in that? It was a different understanding of mission than the church had at that point. They were used to sending people out to do mission, but not necessarily recognizing that God invited us as the church to join him in his mission. And so that was really kind of the transition for us around some of that missional church initiative, was that question of, well, what's God got for us in mission? So it's not just that he needs us to do something for him, but it's also that when we get involved in what he's doing, we get to work with him. We become more Christ-like in our character through that process. There's so many opportunities to be kind of the demonstration plot, if you will, for what God's up to in this place.
Okay, I just want to take you back to the Philippines.
Sure.
In that, I find it interesting. My own tribe, the Christian Missionary Alliance, has over the years had to recognize that perhaps one of the largest alliance churches in the world was the Philippine Alliance Church, and very sending organization. Interestingly, now in Kindersley, Saskatchewan, where I live, a place of less than 5,000 people, and small churches populate our area, we have a strong Filipino group in town. They're
Yep.
very open to help the city. In fact, I think they're the better ones at being hospitable for the
Yes.
city.
Yes.
And maybe you could speak a little bit to how Hamilton, you sort of implied the idea that we had to kind of think in new ways coming back from the Philippines. Was hospitality part of that? What were some of the other things that you came back with?
Well, I think we had by being in another culture and learning from that culture. So some of that hospitality perspective that Filipino culture has, just that privileging the visitor, the guest,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
giving them your best, and being very present in the moment.
Mhm.
So my cultural background was at a high high value on planning ahead and having real great clarity and
Oh yeah.
uh, all good things, but really struggled to just be present in the moment, to celebrate. When you're working among the urban poor, and you come to realize that there's this joy that they have in life, even in the midst of their challenges, and it's a joy that's not coming from their circumstances, but is somehow above that, especially among some of the Christian communities that we got to interact with in those urban poor communities. There was a very powerful witness that came from a different cultural perspective, and so I think it was that understanding that each cultural perspective has something to contribute to our understanding of the gospel. That
Yeah.
there's things that get added to, and depth that comes to our grasp of who Jesus is and what Jesus is up to in our place, as we get as we get some diversity in the mix of who's involved. That really led us to approach what it looked like to be on mission in Hamilton in a slightly different way than maybe the churches
Yeah.
that we were interacting with had access to up to that point.
Okay, let me ask you a question here. I know Hamilton from, well, my mother in the 1940s, it would be, worked in a cannery in Hamilton.
Okay.
In the 1960s, I came as a kid who was living in the Toronto area, came with a school trip. It was Stelco and the steel companies. I
Sure.
came back in the 90s for a meeting, a convention. It was sort of an attempt to be a tourist place. What is Hamilton now, and what would a true city be like in
Yeah.
in Hamilton?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, because I think Hamilton, well, certainly Hamilton's reputation in broader Canadian context wasn't as a place that you would want to go
Right.
for as a tourist destination. Uh,
Yes.
and and we learned fairly quickly on in being here that depending on what impression you wanted somebody to have of Hamilton, you could bring them into the city in a different way, because there, there's a lot more natural beauty. Their normal experience of Hamilton is driving on the QEW towards
Right.
Niagara Falls and seeing the steel mills and so forth. But Hamilton's really had a renaissance in its recognition of its own identity, I'd say, over the last 10, 15 years. If you come in from the other end of the city, there's just a natural beauty to some of the escarpment that
Oh
surrounds
yeah.
Hamilton, and there's numerous waterfalls and all kinds of those things. There's an arts community that's really taken hold in the city, and some of the medical community and some stuff surrounding McMaster University that has given the city a bit of a different feel and identity. There's still a lot of heavy industry, but
Mhm.
that's not the be all and end all that it once was in the city.
So right now you're still working with True City Hamilton,
Yeah.
and I understand you're also doing academic studies and looking at networking and perhaps forwarding some of that. What do you see happening? You've had 17 years now working with a network. Does it work?
Well, it depends on what we mean.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think so. I'd say the conviction that I've come to is the reality is there's always a network of churches in any place where you go, right? So
Right.
if there's more than one church, there's some kind of interaction, some kind of relationship. Maybe it's not always good,
Yeah.
but but I think God's intention for the church in a city is for there to be relationship across differences, and that part of the vibrancy of the gospel in a place is when Christians can relate to each other across their differences and find ways to point to Jesus despite the ways that they might do some things differently. So in that sense, I'd say, yeah, it definitely has been a fruitful way for churches to learn from each other, for churches to resource each other, and the way that's strengthened the witness of those churches has been very encouraging. I think there's been a different tone to the relationship between those churches that has been a witness in and of itself. And sadly, people aren't used to churches being able to work together across denominational lines. So when they hear that there's a network of churches that are pursuing what's best for the city across denominational lines, it gets attention. People wonder, well, why would they do that? So I think there's been a general way in which it's been a great witness, and then there's been specific opportunities where there's been things like working in neighborhood schools, volunteering in neighborhood schools, that as one church learns how to do some of that, another church has the opportunity to learn from that as well. Welcoming refugees to our city, involvement with the arts community, any number of those kinds of things that we've been able to say to each other, hey, there's a couple churches that have an interest in this. We can learn from each other and collaborate with each other and do that better because we're doing that.
Now you're directing the whole. Well, I guess we'll call it directing.
So it is an interesting thing to try to set up a network, right? Because it's intentionally not an organization. So I work for a missions organization called International Teams. I'm on loan, if you will, to this network of churches, but the network is the churches themselves. There's a leadership team and I provide some of the resource so that team can make some plans and have them carried out, and we can bring people together. But really the focus of the network is, well, how is each church able to bring their gifts to the greater whole of what the church is doing in the city? So how do we encourage that kind of cross-congregational pollination? We do some collaborative events. Once a year, we have a conference that brings everybody together. But the day in, day out work isn't so much a directing kind of thing. It's much more of a facilitating collaboration, facilitating relationship between those congregations.
So if you were to look at it in one sense, what you've got is a team saying, here's what we want to do, and you saying, I think we can do that, and facilitating in that.
Yes. Yeah. And oftentimes it's about listening to what the different churches are feeling God leading them into, and so it's partially just staying in touch within the network in a way that when something new and creative bubbles up to the surface, there's an awareness of that. And I think a key thing for me in that kind of work is when I hear the same thing bubbling up in more than one place, you have a sense that, oh, the Spirit's up to something here. We need to pay attention to that. So a current example would be, affordable housing in our city is a huge challenge. prices have been going up. It's really hard for people to find a place to live. How does, and different churches are each facing that in their own neighborhoods, but there's a general question of, so how do we address that? Is there a way that the church can have a part in making housing available? And there's a couple of nonprofits in the city that have an interest in that. So how do we collaborate with each other around something like that? Because that is God's heart for our city, that people would have a home and a place of stability, a place to thrive.
Yeah, yeah. Hamilton is an interesting place. I mean, I've visited there a few times, and depending on whether you're on the hill or down bottom or wherever,
Yep.
You've got different things that are bubbling up. I mean, you've mentioned one thing that's bubbling up. Yeah, are there other? Your wife works with an immigration type of system.
Yeah.
What would you say is bubbling up there right now?
Yeah, so refugee. My wife Allison works specifically around refugee.
Okay.
Yeah, and so and there's a new organization called Open Homes, which has been specifically looking at how churches can do home-based hospitality, how people who have an extra room in their home can, or some extra space in their home can create a place for refugee claimants coming to the city to stay for 3 months while they process their claim and get settled in the city. So that was the vision for that. With the in the midst of a pandemic, when the borders close, that changes
Yeah.
right? And so I think one of the huge global crises right now is the fact that there hasn't been that opportunity for the flow of people to happen, and people are trapped in places that are dangerous, and they're not able to make it to places of safety, and so that's been very difficult for people, especially on the hearts of people who work with refugees, for sure.
Yeah, I could see your wife would have a deep heart cry going on right now. Across the board.
Yeah, and I mean, given the global climate around, just what immigration and refugee movement looks like, that's a difficult place to be. How do we show compassion to the stranger, and how do we recognize that as part of our faith heritage? A strong scriptural theme. And what's it look like for us to welcome the stranger and to show hospitality?
Yeah. Let me jump to something else now.
Sure.
I'm working with a small church organization. We're looking at small churches and the thriving and that type of thing that happens within small churches. How do you see within? Well, let's take Hamilton's network first, and then
Sure.
I think, are you still working with Dunnville?
Not specifically right now, but yes, I did do some.
You do a bit, okay. So let's start with a large city. You've got a number of churches in this network, some very large, some smaller. What do you see as the contribution that small churches provide for a network like this?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think one of the joys of the work that I get to do is to recognize the gift that each church brings to the mix of what's going on in the city. I'd say a passage like 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul's talking about the body, and how the eye can't say to the nose, we don't need you, and how the foot can't say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not important to the body. I think those kinds of attitudes, in my tradition, we usually apply that within a congregation, but I think it applies equally between congregations. And so to recognize that, well, each congregation has a gift that they're bringing to the mix, and that we need to value that gift and give them space, each congregation space to share their gift with the whole. How do we do that? I think small churches have a particular angle on, a particular perspective that they bring. And the people who would be naturally part of a small church, they're seeing and they're living out their faith in a slightly different way than people who would be part of a larger church. And we need that combination of gifts in the mix. And so a lot of the stuff to do with how our network would function is that it's not so much about big events. We would have a conference yearly, but that's not the primary thing that the network's about. It's more about, well, what's happening week in, week out in different parts of the city, and what's each of the churches involved contributing. What are they doing? How are they living out their faith in their place, and how do we learn from each other? So small churches have a vital role to play in that.
So let's take this whole COVID season, and I watch from Saskatchewan. We have whole different restrictions and views on things.
Sure.
Let's take a small church, if you can think of one, put one in mind, and just say, how has this affected them and their ability to be active within a network? Have they had to move into themselves to make sure that they're surviving? Is there, how do you see what's happening?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure we'll know until we kind of come out the other side. I was talking to a pastor yesterday, and just the image of a season of pruning was very central to our conversation. And I think that is kind of the context we're in right now, where we feel like the church has been pruned back, and what's coming next is a question of, so what's going to grow? And where is that life, and trusting that that it'll come back stronger and fuller in the midst of that. But I think a lot of what COVID has involved, and especially around small church realities, is, well, how do we support each other in the midst of this? How do we share information and what we're learning, and how do we keep from people being completely isolated? Being the pastor of a small church can feel very isolating normally. It's much more so in the midst of a pandemic, when you can't be face to face with your congregation half the time, right? And everybody trying to figure out, well, how are we going to do something online? And how do we multiply that kind of know-how so that we can be together, and what actually is good ways to be together in the midst of this. It's different for each church, but I think as churches share, well, this is what we found was helpful for us. Different, you can piece together a bit more by hearing from each other and supporting each other.
Are you piecing anything together yet? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think one of and this probably plays particularly well in a small church kind of context, is that it's really about how we're equipping people to be living out their faith on the ground in smaller cohorts, week by week. That's going to be the heart of vibrant Christianity moving forward, as opposed to some of the larger show realities. That as people have the ability to just simply tune in online to something, the question of, well, will they go back to congregational life, right? Will they show up in places on a Sunday? I think the vibrant small church reality, where it's about people being in community, being face to face, and valuing that kind of community, that kind of fellowship, has more pulling strength, I think, for how people come together. It's not just about, well, what am I receiving? It's about, what do I have to offer to the rest of the congregation, and how do we keep in touch with each other, and how do we take initiative around those things? I feel like that's the upside, that recognizing that how important that is, I think, is an upside to what's been happening in the midst of the pandemic.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, as the old saying goes, in that that's what I'm hearing as well, is that the idea of a smaller cohort whether we're starting to call them micro churches, or I still call them small churches, because small churches work well with that whole relational type of approach, and that's got to be key to working into the future. I'm interested to see what the small churches are going to look like. If you go to Dunnville, you worked with Dunnville. It's a smaller town.
Yeah.
How did you see them? And I don't. Yeah. How did you see that?
Yeah, and through the pandemic, I've not had as much interaction. That was very, kind of a starting point in what was happening there. So I can't really speak very clearly to what I've seen going on there. But yeah, I think smaller town realities work differently. I think people know of each other a bit more than they do in a city kind of context like Hamilton. And I think that creates a different dynamic for how those churches would interact with each other. I'd say that the core thing that's increasingly coming up for me, especially in light of how the cultural realities have gone, is we have the resources within our faith to relate across differences. That's something that Jesus valued and preached, and whether it was relating to Samaritans or to the poor on the edges, or Jesus was always aware of those who were on the margins and calling the disciples to reach out across these boundaries that had been there. How do we interact with people that maybe we disagree with on in some profound ways on some key things, and yet we share Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior? We recognize that we might not practice our faith in the same way, but we hold the gospel. We all recognize the gospel's done something profound in our lives, and that has us in relationship with each other, whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not. And so I think it's how do we act on that's a central question to the kind of work that I've been doing. Is each of the churches in a place has something to contribute, and if I'm willing to recognize that, we may not be able to do everything together. Often we're not, but there are things that we can treat each other with love and respect across those differences, and that's going to show through, because that's not what people are seeing more broadly within the cultural dynamics of what's going on.
Good point. Yeah, very good point. Okay, so we're sort of coming to the end here. I don't like to prolong it, but I would be glad to. I've got about 1,000 questions still to go here. You're going to write a book after you finish your doctoral. That's just what you do. So what are you going to write? What will you say?
Yeah, well, what I was just, that last little rant is pretty central to what's been going on. So I'd say that's really the why of it. For me is when in Ephesians 2, Paul says that on the cross, enmity was put to death. There's nothing that can separate us from each other. The dividing wall has been knocked down. That's not how people often experience the church. They people on the outside looking in see way too many walls between us. So can we find ways to relate across those differences in a way that gives people a picture of the power of the gospel? I think that's a reason for us to be, relating as a network in any place where we are. I think the other piece of it is, well, how do you do that? And for us, it's been finding, a cohort of the willing who are ready to make a difference, or are already involved in some places. And how do we find that combination of both collaborating on some key things through the year, and then having a more informal cooperation, ways that we're just resourcing each other on the move as we do our things within our own congregations through the rest of the year. That collaboration and cooperation has been a very important mechanism for seeing the network function.
All right, I'm ready to read that book. I'm looking forward to it. I'm sitting in the back of my head, having been done a bit of history on the Christian Missionary Alliance. Now, as a tribe, believe this or not, Hamilton, Ontario holds a very vital spot. And I see you smiling, so Lee Beach may have mentioned that to you. The founder of the Alliance pastored there in the 1860s, 70s, and he used to get together in a ministerial, and they would sit around and I understand they'd smoke and do their thing or whatever the pastors did back then, whatever was correct, and just talk about their sermons. Do you guys talk about your sermons?
Yeah, and we have done things where we've done some collaborative discipleship stuff together.
Okay.
As churches, where recognizing that some of the models of discipleship that we'd been given were primarily education based, not practical praxis based kinds of discipleship, and we needed some of that. So pastors coming together to learn and share around that. We have had pulpit exchanges where people have gone to different people. We've spread pastors around to different churches on a Sunday to share their sermons in different places. So yeah, there are those kinds of things. Another kind of core thing that's happened has been a real emphasis on collaborative prayer efforts. So how do we pray for our city together? We just completed an initiative where we were setting up neighborhood prayer walks in different churches, setting up walks in different parts of the city, and then us doing each other's doing prayer walking in different neighborhoods. So those kinds of things do happen within the context of the network.
I find it interesting that here we have a ministerial in Kindersley made up of all sorts of different churches. A new fellow has just come into the Lutheran church here in town, mentioned, this is really interesting. You guys pray for each other as we were getting together. And I thought, I think there's something to be said for that too, as we look to the future. And maybe that's a whole other area that needs to be explored in another podcast. So sure. We'll maybe have to do that. But I want to say very much thank you for hanging out with us, talking a little bit about what's going on. This is exciting. May God bless you and the whole city of Hamilton. I think it's a great place, a catalyst for the rest of Canada. And so may that be true. Thanks again for joining us.
You bet. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.